Is Fridays in Fintech, and we have a very exciting guest today. We have Zarik on here, who he has a very impressive Zarik Khan, who has a very impressive background. He has a lot of letters after his name: CPA, CFE, MBA, CAM, CRCM. Super exciting. He started his career actually, doing spent a decade at Discover, helping everything from audit, compliance, I'm really excited to dive into that. And then went to Google and helped out a lot with their payments, marketing, and devices and services around some of their audit stuff. And then more recently, he is the founder of Finsolute, a Finsolute audit and compliance advisor, a firm dedicated to elevating the standards of audit and compliance. Also writes a really, really great newsletter. Highly recommend tapping into that as well. But Zarik, great to have you on here.
Jake, it's an absolute pleasure. Really love seeing the things that you and Tennis Finance are doing. And I know we had been trying to connect for some time. So just to be on here, especially as you started this great Friday initiative, really honored. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. We try and make it fun over here at Tennis, right? It's and everyone always asks me about the name and stuff, and really, I think as you build in these really hard and sometimes could be kind of boring. People think maybe compliance could be kind of boring or something. Like, how do you make it fun? How do you really create a craft with it? And that's what we try and do over here. But diving into it, I'd love to. We really ask the hard questions starting out. And, I know a lot of stuff's happening in the space right now, especially with Capital One Discover. But I would like to know, do you prefer pineapple on your pizza? Is that a good topping?
Well, considering I just had a pizza about an hour and a half ago, New York pizza, for those
Ooh.
who might be curious, I'm fine with it. I don't have any opposition, but there's got to be a certain with the sweet and sour. There has to be a certain right mix, which I feel like some cuisines get right. Pineapple pizza, I'm not a huge fan of it, but I will say, if you were to ask my aunt, who, believe it or not, and hope I don't upset any stomachs here, is known to mix a cookie and put some ketchup on it, and that, I swear to God, that's her form of sweet and sour. I think it's a little bit more acceptable than that pineapple pizza. So, yeah, that's a little family secret I'm revealing, but yeah.
Do you like that actually? Do you like the ketchup
I
in the
do
cookie?
not. Ever since
Oh,
I've
okay.
been
I was
wondered
like,
how she did that to this day, but hey, some people have their quirks. So yeah.
interesting. So we have a middle of the road answer, like, take it or leave it. Don't feel too strongly either. Typical compliance answer. No, I'm just kidding. Awesome. Cool. So really, as you know, Capital One is actually looking into purchasing Discover. One, we can get into that a little bit later, but I'd love to kind of understand your journey into going into Discover and what you learned there. What were some interesting things that happened that really shaped your career in compliance and audit?
Absolutely. So the story with me and Discover actually goes well past a decade, even earlier than that. So
Oh,
I was in college, was taking a information systems course, and was really trying hard to get an A and make the honor roll that semester, and uh, unfortunately got a B plus. And so I was really bummed out. And the professor was like, "But you know what? I'm gonna introduce you to a potential opportunity that might make you forget about this B plus." And that opportunity turned out to be potentially, which I had to go through the interview process, of course, and everything. It turned out to be an internship with a company at the time which was owned by Morgan Stanley, which is Discover. This was in
mm,
I think in the mid 2000s, before they had gone public, and
mm,
so that was my first introduction to the company. Couple years went by. I decided not to go. Did a couple other things until about 2011, and as I told people once I joined Discover again, I said I came to my senses and came back. So
mm.
yeah, from there, 2011 onwards, I joined the internal audit department, And really, the best part about internal audit for me being new to financial services at the time was that it really allowed me to, having started working on audits of the credit card business initially, really gave me a flavor of how a bank works, how an issuing business works. And I, through the course of maybe like a 3 year period, 4 year period, I got to see everything about a credit card issuer from the beginning. We're talking about underwriting, we're talking about acquisition marketing, targeting, all the way to what you call the end of the consumer life cycle, which includes collections and charge off and everything in between. You're talking about fraud, customer service, credit management, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many different dimensions to just that issuing business. And of course, the unique thing that sets Discover apart, which if those who have listened and read the headlines about Capital One have heard, is that the network piece, while it wasn't what I worked on, there were so many synergies and unique synergies that Discover as an issuing business had with Discover as a network, which I got to play in several times when you're talking about things like authorization, where there's an issuer piece, there's a network piece. When you're talking about disputes, where there's an issuer piece, there's a network piece, and on and on. There's so many pieces that had this unique interplay that I don't think you could have seen in any organization. Maybe Amex, American Express, would be the only other instance where you'd have that. So I was fortunate enough career-wise to start off as an individual contributor and just had some really, really good mentors and good opportunities. And of course, being in the right place, the right time, and was able to eventually have an opportunity to oversee the entire credit card audit space and got to work with folks in compliance, folks in risk, oversee audit's role in essentially doing like pre-audit or pre-launch audits of some new products that the company launched. So it was an incredible run, and I'm really grateful for my time there. I feel like it just was the most transformative experience in my career from one particular place that I've been. So that's in a nutshell.
It's pretty interesting. And so kind of you were involved with product launches as well as kind of stuff that was ongoing. I mean, were there any areas that really surprised you or, you thought was way more nuanced? I know payments, issuing, all that stuff is so nuanced once you really get into it. But I'd love to hear from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think the piece that it maybe doesn't get talked about as much, but as consumers who use credit cards, we see a lot of it. It's actually the fraud space. And for me, it was fascinating. It was actually in my time Discover, it might have been the second audit I ever did when I was there looking at fraud. This is the fraud prevention and fraud investigation. So from an issuer side, if a consumer essentially swipes the card and that transaction is potentially fraudulent just because there's some patterns that are detected it can be fraudulent, or there's some issue with the location, or sometimes if you purchase from the same merchant in rapid succession, sometimes some issuers will flag your card. And that's an example of what can happen. But why does that happen? Because there's these incredibly sophisticated fraud models that are doing a lot of this work behind the scenes. And the piece that really surprised me about that was there are hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands of rules that folks in these fraud teams actually spend and put in time and effort to come up with. So there's a lot of thinking of scenarios that has to be done by many of these fraud teams. And so some of what we did as far as doing audit testing was we would actually look at some of those rules and say, okay, well, let's actually see if we can test out whether these rules are working as intended. And there's so many different caveats with those rules. It's almost like a form of coding, if you will. It says, okay, well, if this condition exists, then you're going to do this. If not, so a lot of decision tree, if-then logic that's involved there. It is a model after all, but I just found that to be super fascinating. And then the investigation side was a little bit more manual because this is sort of after the fact where, hey, we've decided that, yeah, this is actually fraud happening. We've, in some cases, I'm sure folks have experienced where your card has to get shut down and they give you a new card. The reason they do that is because essentially in their system, the old account is basically pulled into this investigation process where at their own pace, more or less, the agents will work behind the scenes and try to essentially find out what happened, try to recover the funds. And sometimes that recovery can get into really interesting things where you talk about these dark fraud rings that are sitting in different parts of the world, and they've
Yep.
got this sophisticated technology where they're essentially trying to take over customers' credit cards and bank accounts and that sort of thing. So sometimes this investigation process can cause the teams to link up with very interesting law enforcement type groups to essentially be involved in that whole process of recovery. So it's very complex, but I found that to be the most interesting and nuance. I said the nuance that became clear and just was eye opening, as you said. So
That's pretty funny. There, we were talking to this one financial institution, and they were saying, "Hey, is there a way for us to kind of scrape Reddit? And all right, there's some like unique, like they're talking about stuff here. Can we create like an agent that goes in and looks at like the latest patterns, bring that back so we can kind of watch for those specific things?" And it makes me think, where is this evolving? Is this going to be a mix? This is going to be probably a mix of AI, human ingenuity, and then also just looking into the dark web as like an undercover agent to see what's happening and then implementing that into their stack. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
yeah, what you're saying is actually so another area I looked at, in which Discover and many companies now have this, is actually a lot of vendors in the social media space. In 2011, 2012 in particular, Discover was starting to engage with these vendors. They were able to scrape Twitter, for example, which at that time was really starting to take off in a way that it had before, and publicly available news sites. And today that would be a source of information, just consumer sentiment, U.S. or around the world, just general sentiment of online users, Reddit. So I feel like with APIs and these platforms at least allowing that scraping to happen in a way that makes sense and doesn't necessarily overload the servers, I think there's a lot that can be done. And frankly, I'm the biggest believer that if you're a company and you're trying to understand the industry sentiment or just sentiment about your brand, your company, your product, whatever it is you're doing, you need to have something that maybe not go like that far where you're looking at all of Reddit, but you certainly need to have a form of like monitoring for what's going on. I mean, the simplest thing to do would be to at least know what your own complaints that your own customers are making about what you've got going on. So I think it's essential. I think if you're not doing it as a company, it doesn't matter what you're doing. You're probably setting yourself up for failure, or at a minimum, embarrassment. So I think it's important to do it with your customers, and doing it with the industry even larger, or just out there in a broader sense, is very very wise.
Yeah, it's super fascinating, especially one getting insights out of your current communications, your current customer communications, complaints, and seeing not only some people are maybe unhappy or there's could be regulatory violations, but also are there fraud violations happening within our communications, and scanning for that. I mean, that's a really interesting way to look at it as well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think yeah, those comms can tell you so much as well, like just how people are engaging with them. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and the way that LLMs and just looking at unstructured data is just getting better and better and better. It's pretty. It blows my mind. It's pretty insane.
I think you and I were talking last time about some of the work that you're thinking about as far as LLMs and just AI in general. And so, I mean, I am somebody who is kind of getting my hands around that whole world still. I know last year, ChatGPT, everybody's talking AI, but I think like if you're not bringing yourself up to speed with the capabilities of just A, mass consumption of information, but B, like mass processing and learning of information by these tools and what essentially are models, you're also behind in that case. So I kudos to you and your team for the work that you are doing, trying to bring that intersection of AI and compliance, which I think is fascinating and something that I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in.
Oh yeah, it's fascinating. I mainly blame my team though. But really, kind of what's interesting, you went from Discover to Google, and Google's they're having their own kind of AI stuff as well. We don't have to talk about that, but it's kind of, what was that process like going to, Discover is really this looked up upon this great player in the finance space, to Google, and seeing the audit there as well. Like how was that transition?
Yeah, so just starting at a higher level, I one of the reasons why going to Google appealed to me, um, obviously it's a big tech company. A lot of people want to work there. It
Yep.
takes good care of people with some of its benefits and perks and that sort of thing. But for me, the place where I was at in my career, I just was winding down, doing my executive MBA at Kellogg, which I'm wearing the shirt
Mm,
representing. So had to
yeah.
throw in.
Nice.
But as winding down the MBA, I was thinking about just where to take my career, and I felt it was a natural progression from where I had kind of done this thing about going in the financial services space, really getting
Hmm.
a flavor for a company with a national reach, with customers that were across the US. And for me, the possibility of maybe going on a more global scale, which is what Google offers, was one of, I think, the
Mm.
biggest factors that drove me to consider the opportunity there. And the specific opportunity I had was focused on, as you said, payments, devices and services and marketing. But it was really the payments space that excited me because at the time, this was public news, so it wasn't a secret, but it was just sort of initially announced was that Google and Citi were thinking about a collaboration to launch potentially like
Oh,
Google's answer to the Apple Card. At least that would have been the
interesting.
possible outcome. And so that for me was somewhere where I thought, hey, this might be somewhere where I can bring in my expertise from working at Discover for all these years, being a part of an issuer.
Hmm.
And hey, if even though Google isn't necessarily going to be the issuer, they're more of a processor, and they've got co-branding with
Hmm.
Citi. Even still having that perspective, I think was something I felt was a valuable contribution I could bring. Unfortunately, shortly after I joined, Google Citi negotiations um, over this product, they didn't work out, and so the product, was never launched, and Google's
Mm.
efforts to kind of put into and customers are redirected to other initiatives that Google's cloud team was working on, which also happened to intersect with the fintech space. But for me, I was still really fortunate. I got to just be involved with the maintenance, and even in some cases, just participating in some of the board governance for Google's many payment licenses. And that was a
Oh.
global matter. Internal audit has a role to play when you're talking about money transmitter licenses in various jurisdictions where Google wanted to do business. So even though the audits themselves that were relating to those licenses weren't necessarily complicated, looking at things like the Google Pay product itself, like agnostic of
Mm.
any jurisdiction, just looking at that product, those reviews. I mean, just getting to dig in with engineers and
Hmm.
product managers and TPMs and just not me directly because I actually was fortunate enough to manage a team and help to grow and support a team of folks within Google's audit who would actually get to like really dig in and sit down and poke around at some of the code, like just being a part of that and helping to provide audits perspective. I think that was just an incredible experience, like a once in a lifetime opportunity. So I'm grateful for that, and I think there's very few places that you can really dig into products that are scaled that far and wide, or companies that are
Mm.
scaled that far and wide, and really just be able to see the guts of how that works. I think it's just it's amazing, just getting to do that.
Oh, that sounds really cool. And growing up, right,
Yeah,
it's like working at Google. They even made a video about like I think it was Owen Wilson and Vince Vaughn working at Google, or like a rip off
yeah,
of
yeah,
Google, right? And
yeah,
I
yeah.
got buddies that work there as well. You
Yeah,
good?
it's such a huge company. I mean,
Hmm.
I think that's maybe the one thing I would say, which was a little overwhelming at times, is just because you're like Discover at the time I left was around somewhere between 10 to 15,000 people national, and
That's
it's
still
it's
pretty good.
large, it's fairly large.
That's
You
pretty
look at
good.
LinkedIn,
Yeah.
yeah, when you look at LinkedIn, you see the thing in the analytics, it says 10,000 plus employees, like LinkedIn kind of cuts off at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But with Google, I mean, we all know it's like, I think it's over 100,000 full-time employees, and then 100,000 more that are contractors, or as Google calls them,
Mm-hmm.
TVCs. It's just
Mm.
it's mind-boggling at times, and so sometimes, being very forthright, the challenge was trying to navigate that. I mean, you had time zones to deal with, you had folks in different divisions to try and work with, and in some cases, you would find in one vertical or one team, you have folks doing a different version of, let's say, risk and compliance, and in other teams, from your perspective, it looks like they might be doing the same thing, but they're sort of taking a
Mm-hmm.
specific slice of a topic and looking at that. So, as an auditor, trying to bring that all together and really get a handle on risks, it's a unique challenge that I don't think you can get in many places. And we had a small but scrappy team, that tried to handle all this globally, and it was a lot of fun. I have to say, it really was.
Oh,
Um,
that,
yeah,
that's amazing. Did you ever deal with regulators while you were there directly, or? Um,
yeah. Actually, I did have the opportunity to do so. So in the U.S. There's a number of state licenses to run the Google Pay product and some of the other products that have payment
Mainly just
processing that
MTLs,
Google
or?
has. Um, there's a few other licenses. I mean, it's mostly MTLs, but because we had those licenses at the state level, they'd be what was called like these multi-state exams, which anyone who has those
Hmm.
licenses is subject to on, I believe it's an annual basis. Sometimes it can be a little bit more frequent than that. So getting to work with the state regulators was actually a brand new experience for me, because I had been working with federal regulators previously. But it was great, getting to kind of explain what we're doing, and talking about how we felt internal audit was sort of contributing to the overall risk ecosystem at Google, and specifically Google Payments. I think it was a good opportunity. Many times, if folks aren't aware, when you're in the middle of a regulatory exam, uh, it's more or less that you are actually trying to educate the regulator about your process and your controls and what you have in place. And if you're an exam function yourself, like audit or compliance testing, you're usually telling them what you're doing. And many times they're actually making a determination on whether or not they can rely on your work. Because frankly,
Interesting.
especially audit being independent,
Yep.
if audit is doing what it's supposed to do, that's a huge burden off the rest of the company's back, because then the regulator won't really dig into things that audit has already sort of kicked the tires on. So,
Hmm.
for those who maybe look at audit suspiciously, internal audit, say, oh, why do I need to, play ball with them? Play ball with them, because audit digging in and maybe finding something big is going to ensure that the regulator, I can't say this like across the board, of course, but in my
Hmm.
experience, the regulator, if they can and they feel that the function is strong and the work makes sense, they will rely on it and they will go look at something else. It's not like they won't review
Yeah.
at all. They'll just pick something different
Yeah.
to focus on. So,
Yeah, and from my understanding, right, it's kind of like it's your job to really communicate, hey, these are all the amazing controls we have in place. This is all the amazing testing we have with all the latest technologies. Let me try and explain to you as best as possible, so you build that trust, and they like, oh yeah,
yeah,
they're really on it for these things. Yeah.
I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't call it amazing controls, like, make it a sales pitch, because some regulators can like, some
So-
regulators can see through that. But, you
yeah,
do
yeah,
say,
yeah.
like, I mean, they'll get excited if you say, and you hope it isn't like a really big deal, because if that's the case, I think the regulators might be the least of the company's concerns, right? But let's say, like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
we found a bunch of these things where a system wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, and the team wasn't aware of it, and they patched it up, and so now we're good. I mean, it gives them the comfort that, hey, this function is doing what it should. And when you talk about like a three lines of defense model, that gives them comfort
Mm-hmm.
that, hey, even if there's problems that are happening, that, let's say, we identify in our regulatory exam, we're not going to really slap you with a fine or make a consent order out of it. We might give you, there's three different levels to these regulatory, like responses, so to speak, where they'll give you an MRA
Mm-hmm.
or an MRIA, both of which are not public, and then the consent
Mm-hmm.
order, which is public. So if they give you an
Mm-hmm.
MRA,
Mm-hmm.
that's probably like the best case scenario. In some cases, they might just even give you a recommendation, which is like even lower than that, sort of like kind of like a light, hey, not even a slap on the wrist, just like a tap on the shoulder and say, hey, go
Mm-hmm.
fix this. So if you do that, like that'll audit sort of doing what it needs to do will
Mm-hmm.
increase the chances that that's what will happen. Where the regulator can't just ignore some things, especially if it's in their initial scope. But you
Mm.
know, yeah, I think
Yeah.
having a strong audit and compliance function is key when you're anticipating regulatory scrutiny.
That's super. Have you written about that, by the way? The kind of that whole process and what you've seen.
Maybe I should.
Maybe you should,
Yeah, I'll think
because
about it.
you
Yeah,
always see these like consent orders and all these letters, and it's like, well, what was the kind of how did it get there?
yeah,
What is that typical flow? And I think people would love to hear that.
yeah,
But kind of on the
yeah.
more
Go ahead.
relevant, I was gonna say the relevant topic. I mean, you wrote briefly about Capital One and Discover. I'd love to hear real quick. We don't have a lot of time left. Kind of like your thoughts on that, where that's going, what innovation is going to happen because of that. And also, does anyone get harmed because of that? Is there any kind of other stuff happening there as well?
Yeah. Well, I will say, like for me, just one point of note. I think this is it's not a surprise in the macro sense that Discover is being acquired because the network that Discover has is sort of as the Capital One CEO Richard Fairbank was saying on the sort of announcement call he had with the investing community on Tuesday. He's calling it the crown jewel. It just was
Mm.
gushing about the network, and that network has been in the
Wow.
news as a potential acquisition target for like the last 10, 11 years. I think Apple,
Mm.
when they were launching Apple Pay, there were some discussions in the news that they were actually thinking about buying Discover just to launch Apple Pay with their own network in house. And ultimately,
Wow.
they decided to play ball with Visa and Mastercard, and launched with on their own, basically partnering with other banks instead. But later on, Wells Fargo was in the news thinking about buying Discover again for the same reason. Like the network was the
Mm.
real appeal that they had, and now finally Capital One has come in. I think a couple things, right? So it's a huge benefit to Capital One. I do think that when you look at the networks that are out there, the Visa, Mastercard, Discover, Amex, a lot of talk is, and I'll be writing about this in the next parts of the Capital One buys Discover Now What series that I started. Um, I think the thing to consider, which a lot of people are wondering, well, the regulator is going to approve this or not. On one hand, you could say, yeah, well, now we've got the biggest issuer just created by this merger slash acquisition, where Chase, I think in the U.S. was the biggest issuer. With this combination, if it goes through, it'll be this Capital One with Discover as part of it. But the other thing to consider, on the other hand, is that this could really, especially with the intent that was being talked about on the call, this could really give Visa and Mastercard some competition. I'm not going to say that they are in danger of being displaced by this, but a serious number three might emerge
Mm.
over time because the way Capital One was talking about the network, they were saying, well, we're not just happy like taking over and using it to improve our merchant relationships. We really want to take this thing global. We know that Discover tried a global focus with Diners Club and just with their attempts at sort of taking the Discover global network in different directions. But I mean, the way they were talking and the resources they have at their disposal, I mean, this could be huge. As far as what could harm, I would say, and I sort of made a small observation on some LinkedIn what I thought was going to be small. I mean, it's the employees. I
Mm-hmm.
can't help but be sympathetic to many of my former colleagues. The folks that work there, especially for Discover, the brand is synonymous on TV when you see the ads. It's folks sitting in a call center. I mean, Discover is proud of having 24/7 US based customer service, very friendly.
Mm.
And I've been in those call centers. I've seen
Wow.
what is essentially the lifeblood of the company. And so when I made my small post on it, I was sort of blown away with just how many people responded to that, kind of
Mm.
giving an indication to what folks are feeling right now. As even though this
Mm.
deal presents a lot of excitement, a lot of opportunity from a business perspective, from a human perspective, really who knows what's going to happen. And it's a little uncertain and probably scary for folks who are sitting certainly on the Discover side, certainly in their call centers, but even potentially at Capital One. You just don't know. So I really hope that as folks think about this deal and cover it, that they do keep the future of the folks that are going to be powering this combined company in mind, because you really don't know in this day and age, especially unfortunately with layoffs going on, and self being a
Yeah.
victim of the big tech layoffs last year. It
Mm-hmm.
just you hope for the best, and you hope that
Yep.
some of the human element is considered as if the deal moves forward, and as the companies merge and combine.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of crazy. Great take, by the way. And unfortunately, we are out of time. But Zarek, this was incredible. I wish we could have gone on probably 30 minutes longer. And
Yeah.
what we like to do at the for our guests is we love closed loop systems, no KYC. So we're gonna gift you a gift card to, let's see, what random Midwestern restaurant. We're gonna go with Chili's today. So Chili's, you got a nice little gift card to Chili's,
All
no
right.
KYC required. But thanks
All
again,
right.
and thanks everyone for tuning in to Fridays in FinTech. Zarek, great chatting, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks for having me, Jake. Really appreciate it. Have a good weekend.
Of course. All right. See ya. Oh.